translator's preface to the Phenomenology of Mind, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Phenomenology of Mind, Volume 1 by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, translated by James Black Bailey. Translator's preface. The work here translated and offered to the English philosophical reader has long been recognized as a unique product of Teutonic genius and as, on the whole, perhaps the most remarkable treatise in the history of modern philosophy. Alike in its style of thinking, its manner of expression, the comprehensiveness of its survey, and the wealth of its material, it can hardly be said to have a parallel. Tracts of experience, which have each formed from time to time the subject of separate discussion, have engaged the undivided interest of different thinkers, and are here treated as but fragments of a single system. Movements of human history, which have marked epochs in the development of the human race, are looked on as but typical or prominent embodiments of principles at work in the spirit of man, and are discussed in shadowy schematic form, through which the historical realities referred to is only dimly visible. Acknowledged truths of science are stripped of their apparent self-containedness and independence, and are reduced to phases of the necessary movement of human intelligence. The supreme importance assigned by mankind to religion are not allowed to obscure the fact that religion is but one act in the drama of spiritual existence. Even to the work of philosophy there is assigned but a relative, though necessary, place. Man in his lifetime must needs play many parts, and one of these is to be a philosopher, and all philosophies are here regarded as but phases of a single mood. The imposing array of philosophical positions constituting the history of philosophy are abbreviated into a central principle which together evolve a single comprehensive truth, controlling the minds of individual philosophers, though all unknown to themselves. So exhaustive an analysis of the life history of the human spirit, so sustained an effort to reduce its complex and involved harmonies to their simple elemental leading motives, and to express these controlling ideas in an orderly connected system, has certainly never been compressed within the compass of a single treatise. The courage which made such an effort possible was no doubt in large measure due to the state of the intellectual atmosphere at the time when the book was being written, an atmosphere surcharged with grand and grandiose ideas which were capable of stimulating and sustaining philosophical enthusiasm, or of exciting and intoxicating speculative ambition. Inspired by the promise and potency of the Kantian philosophy, Kant's immediate successors made bold to set sail on speculative seas unknown, with a fraction of their master's scientific knowledge, and none of his philosophical prudence. Influenced in Hegel, as Hegel undoubtedly was, by the confident daring of these earlier intellectual adventurers, it was not long before a mind so concrete as his, and with so reverent a regard for scientific truth and practical fact, saw the necessity for chaining speculative imagination to the solid ground of tried and verifiable experience. It might be possible to dispense with the things in themselves, but it was not possible to dispense with the things. If the new philosophy was to make any claim to a connected system of ideas, appealing to old and satisfying the common reason of mankind, the wealth of familiar and accessible truth in science, history, and ordinary experience must be at our disposal before philosophy can take with assurance the high road of comprehensive systematic knowledge. The constant if cryptic reference throughout the whole of the following treatise to facts of nature, and human history amply testifies at any rate to the seriousness with which Hegel endeavoured to meet the demand of all true philosophy. In this sense the work before us in large measure is a reaction against the soaring insubstantiality of the ingenious manipulation of principles in abstracto and the wearisome unmethodical constructions of the works which intervened between the Kantian analysis of experience and the appearance of the Phenomenology in 1807. It is therefore small surprise that, though the appearance of the book was hailed with great expectation, the work was received with coldness and dissatisfaction by those who had, up to this point, been Hegel's teachers and friends. But while an enormous wealth of representative material lies behind the treatise, partly illuminating the argument, partly determining the course of its development, it need not be supposed that the author could possibly lay claim to omniscience. From first to last it is apparent that the author was limited by the information available at his time, by the scientific views prevalent during his day, and by his own selective interest in the material presented before him. Only in one department was his knowledge sufficiently adequate to reduce this limitation to a negligible characteristic. This was in the department of history, and more especially the history of philosophy. But here it may well be said the material was regarded as primarily representative and typical of movements of the human spirit, so that errors of fact or detail for the purpose of this treatise are insignificant. Even so, the selection of such material is governed both by his interest in the problem of the phenomenology and also by the intellectual attitude and bias of the time. A selection under conditions imposes restrictions on the character of the argument of the treatise. Such limitations as those indicated are doubtless inevitable, and they help us explain many of the more singular peculiarities or even obvious defects of the work. Subjects are treated in this book with a fullness and even diffuseness of analysis which must now seem utterly out of proportion to the value of what is discussed. For example, Hegel devotes much labour to demonstrating the hollow pretentiousness of the pseudo-sciences of phrenology and physiognomy, and endeavours to bring to light the truth which they had misconstrued. The explanation is that in his day these twin scientific impostures had great success and won much favour from learned and unlearned alike. The scientific function of observation, again, is dealt with at inordinate length, doubtless because of the success which attended the scientific investigation of nature towards the end of the 18th century. So too is the constantly recurring reference to states of spiritual life, which were familiar features of the Romantic movement, is only to be explained by the outstanding historical importance of this movement at the time the book was written. But the omissions from the treatise are as remarkable as the exaggerated attention devoted to some aspects of experience and relatively to others. In a work ostensibly dealing with the whole range of human experience, it seems surprising to find no specific discussion of our knowledge of space or of number or of the sphere of fact dealt with by chemistry, or again, to take another domain of experience remote from these, there is no mention at all of the fine arts like music or painting. Such omissions are all the more striking when we bear in mind Hegel's keen appreciation of the value of both pure science and fine art, and when we remember that in his later works a full and elaborate treatment is given to the subjects mentioned. It is not enough to plead in excuse that he is dealing in this work with the main types of experience, and that what is not explicitly discussed is implied in the analysis of the type selected, for it seems obvious that the kinds of knowledge of art and above referred to play a unique part in experience and are not simply specific forms of more general types of experience. Looking at the plan of the treatise as a whole, and the method of treatment assigned to the forms of experience brought under review, an impartial critic is bound to admit that the scheme of work is unbalanced and out of proportion. The discussion of some parts is foreshortened, and in other cases subjects are treated with an elaborateness of detail in which the main idea is overborne by the sheer mass of the material used to elucidate it. At times, indeed, the writer seems to have become so absorbed with the particular subject in hand that for the time being he seems to have lost sight of the plan and purpose of the argument of the whole treatise. In such cases the author's description of his work as a voyage of discovery has a literalness of application which is more accurate than complimentary to the author. For the business of a writer is to determine the chart of his argument before he sets out in this literary expedition, and not to draw it afterwards in order to discover what coasts of truth he has visited. Hegel himself felt that in many parts the argument had been overweighted, and expressed the hope in a letter to his friend Niethammer that he might be able to, in a second edition, load some of the ballast and get the ship to float more easily. The last part of this work is especially unsatisfactory. To the discussion of religion and absolute knowledge, one would naturally have expected the author to have devoted the greatest care and the best of his energies, for it was one of the main objects of his task to explain and justify the place of philosophical knowledge in the plan of human experience. Yet, the analysis of religion is condensed, fragmentary, inadequate to the theme, while the statement of absolute knowledge is brief and elliptical to the verge of obscurity. This is disappointing, more particularly after the long and carefully wrought argument dealing with the sphere of moral and social experience which immediately precedes the section on religion. Defects certainly demand some explanation, and it is to be found in the circumstances under which the last part of the treatise was written. In a letter to Schelling, in which Hegel promises to send him a copy of the book, Hegel asks indulgence for the unsatisfactory character of the last parts of the work, and says, as if by way of explanation, that the composition of the book was concluded at midnight before the Battle of Jena. This sounds a little hollow and melodramatic. One naturally asks what the roar of Napoleon's cannons had to do with the philosophical delineation of the Absolute. The Absolute, as well as his expositor, could surely afford to wait until the smoke of such temporalities had cleared. In any case, on the night before the battle, there could have been no serious cannonade to disturb Hegel's meditation. In point of fact, the Prussian general himself did not expect Napoleon to attack on the 14th day of October, the day of the battle, and it is extremely unlikely that Hegel could have been so certain of Napoleon's plans as to feel constrained to hurry in the completion of his book in case of eventualities. No doubt after the battle, affairs in Jena were uncomfortable and sufficiently uncertain to induce Hegel to carry about in his pocket the manuscript finished on the night of the 13th, and to defer till the the 20th, when things had quietened down, the dispatch of his manuscript to Bamberg. The real explanation was much more commonplace. Hegel had made an unfortunate arrangement with his publisher. Instead of waiting till the manuscript of the work was actually finished before sending it to the publisher, Hegel arranged to let the publisher have it in installments. The publisher was to pay so much a sheet. First payment was to be made when half the entire manuscript was in his hands. Printing began in February 1806. Any publisher could easily have made sure of getting the best of such a bargain. In this case, the publisher was a printer, publisher and bookseller all in one, a singularly dangerous position for an impecunious man of letters to deal with. When Hegel had sent what he took to be half the manuscript of the book and demanded payment accordingly, the publisher declared himself unable to feel satisfied that this really was half of the manuscript. Payment was therefore refused, and further, the edition of 1,000 copies originally agreed upon was altered now to one of 750, with a corresponding diminution of payment to the author. Hegel, being much in need of the money, appealed in despair to his friend Neithammer, then living in Bamberg, the place of publication, and asked his good offices to urge the publisher to forward the money. The publisher was obdurate. Finally, Neithammer made a new contract with the publisher, whereby Neithammer agreed to pay the publisher so much should Hegel fail to send the last of the manuscript by the 18th of October 1806. The new contract was made on the 29th of September. By great effort, Hegel managed to send off a large instalment on the 8th and 10th of October, promising faithfully to send the last remaining instalment by the 13th. Meantime, Napoleon appeared on the scene, and hostilities with Prussia were definitely declared from Bamberg on the 7th of October. The proximity of this Weltschee on the horseback added to Hegel's anxieties and difficulties, for there could be no certainty that the postal arrangements would be efficiently carried out and the manuscript safely reach its destination, either in due time or at all. Hegel was in agony, for the loss of time would be serious to his friend and the loss of the manuscript irreparable to himself. It was in these circumstances that the last part of the Phenomenology was composed. With his mental energies strained to keep pace with the flight of time, his personal honour at stake, with the roll of war in his ears, and a pitiless publisher master of his financial resources, even Hegel could hardly be expected to be in the appropriate frame of mind necessary to compose the dialectical hymn of absolute knowledge. There is thus some excuse, and at any rate sufficient explanation, for the curtailed analysis, the hurried argument, the condensed utterance which characterise the last stages of the work. But the result as it now appears must be taken as it stands. Valuable as it is not a fully elaborated development of one of the richest and most important parts of the whole range of experience. It is not an ample and measured survey of the domain of the absolute. It is speculative steeplechasing. But these deficits, avoidable and unavoidable, to which reference has been made, do not seriously impair the monumental greatness of the work. No man can escape from the limitations of his own individuality any more than he can avoid the restrictions imposed on him by the circumstances of his time. The very attempt to rise above them requires the assistance to support the effort. We cannot therefore expect that the work before us, which, as we shall see, is so closely concerned with history, should be unaffected by the conditions under which the historical phenomena exist. The translator has endeavoured throughout the book to indicate the train of thought connecting the successive stages in the analysis. It will suffice here to indicate the general character and purpose of the work and to draw out the main thread. In general terms, the Phenomenology of Mind is a comprehensive and systematic survey of the ways in which experience appears. This explains the meaning of the term phenomenology, a term employed by Lambert in his work The New Organon, 1764, and later by Kant, who uses the word to cover the metaphysical interpretation of the idea of motion, which forms the concluding section of his Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, 1786. The survey seeks to accomplish threefold result. Number one, to show the various forms of experience constitute a continuous and connected series of stages of the mind, that life of mind as a whole is thus a single continuous movement. 2, to vindicate for each typical form of experience a necessary place in the plan of the whole. 3, to prove that the self-comprehension of spirit, absolute knowledge, is the necessary demand, the inevitable outcome, and the final consummation of the entire process of experience. These three aspects of the argument essentially involve one another. Without some single principle present throughout the series of forms, they could not be connected together. Spirit in this principle, without some single end dominating the movement from first to last, the movement could not be continuous. Absolute knowledge is this end. Unless each stage has a definitive positive value of its own, no connection could be established between them. The moments of experience would be illusory and the experience as a whole meaningless, a series of negations which would not even be a series and certainly could not give us a system of truth. The source of this positive significance of each step is again absolute knowledge, and finally, unless absolute knowledge were the outcome of the whole process, either there would be no absolute at all and the process would be endless and so unintelligible, or else the absolute would simply appear as shot out of a pistol, and hence would itself be unintelligible, the process of experience is necessary to the meaning of the Absolute, as the Absolute is necessary to give meaning to the process. There seems no reason to doubt that all three aspects of this result were present in the author's mind before he proceeded to work on the argument in the treatise. This seems obvious in itself, and a perusal of his introduction conclusively shows this to have been the case. The ways in which he varies the description of the character of the treatise arising from laying emphasis on one or other of the features of the argument. The term Phenomenology of Mind has in view the fact that we are here dealing with the procession of the nodes of mind and the form in which this experience appears. The term Sciences of Experience of Consciousness, by which he describes it on the title page of the first edition, a designated omitted apparently by Hegel and his editors in the subsequent edition, lays stress on the second aspect above noted, the constructive interpretation of the positive value of each phase of experience. The development of science, or again, the development of the natural consciousness up to the level of science, by which he designates the work, refers to the relation of movement of experience to its final outcome and end, a relation in virtue of which he also speaks of the work as the first part of a system of science and an introduction to a speculative science in general. To interpret experience in the manner above indicated, it is necessary to find at the outset a conception of experience which will apply both to the experience as a whole and to every form the experience appears. The term experience is indefinite and hence has been used by different thinkers and for different purposes. Accepting the result of Kant's analysis, Hegel regards experience as constituted by an interrelation of subject and object. The interrelation takes the form of conscious awareness of an object. The movements are distinct, and the unity of these factors is simply the mental process holding them together in a single mental situation and distinguishing them from each other within that state. The moments are inseparable and have neither existence nor significance except in conscious relation to the other. Till the distinction arises, there is no experience. After it disappears, there is equally no experience. Kant held that the relation disappeared if a particular kind of object, a sense object, disappeared or could not be produced. From this followed his things of view per se, apart from experience, and of ideas of reason, beyond the bounds of experience. Both notions are connected together. Accepting temporary criticism of Kant, Hegel rejected both notions and hence rejected Kant's restriction of experience to sense phenomena. The subject-object relation was still maintained as the essential nature of experience, but whereas in virtue of the above restriction Kant admitted a subject-object relation to hold where there was no experience, for example in the sphere of reason, Hegel extended the term experience to each and every conscious relation of subject and object. In this way, Hegel was in closer touch with the fact of common usage and carried it to its legitimate conclusion as a fruitful principle established by Kant. This extension of Kant's principle both removed its limitations and deepened its meaning. What Kant meant by insisting that sense objects were necessary for experience was that in all experience there must be a given or immediate element. But Kant identified the given or immediate with sense objects. Here, no doubt, givenness must seem very prominent and very obvious. This givenness, which is so obviously a feature of sense facts, is, however, largely due to the striking mental contrast between thought and sense. In truth, the immediate is found in many other forms besides that of sensibility, and on Kant's own showing, even the givenness of sense involves an operation of the subject before entering experience. Kant confounds the immediacy, which is essential to the relation of subject and object, with a particular kind of immediacy found in a particular kind of relation of subject to object, viz. Sense experience or consciousness of sense objects. In other words, he identified a formal character of all experience with a peculiar content of one kind of experience. Hegel saw that the very nature of conscious relation of a subject and object implied the subject and object were in all cases immediately related to one another. But this is only the first step in the relationship, the formal condition of there being a relationship at all. The relation is not static, it is a process or conscious movement, in the constitution of which two terms are distinct and distinguishable factors, the movement being simply the process of uniting the two in a single and complete mental situation. This process, as contrasted with immediacy, is described as the condition of mediation. It is essential to the total state of immediacy, and in the nature of the case is absolutely inseparable from immediacy. Kant had been at pains to establish the necessity of such a mediating process in the constitution of experience, but had again interpreted this in a one-sided way. For Kant, the mediation was introduced in the form of an intellectual operation of manipulating the material of sense which somehow the mind appropriated externally. Just as there was one kind of immediacy, that of sense, so there was only one kind of mediation, that of understanding. The error in the interpretation of the former has its counterpart in the interpretation of the latter. The correction of the error takes the same line in both cases. Sense immediacy is only one way in which the immediacy appears in the general relation of subject and object. Intellectual mediation through understanding is but one of the many ways in which the mediation of subject through object and object through subject take place. There are, in short, many forms of mediation, as there are forms of immediacy, for both are required and found in every possible relation of subject and object. But the transformation of Kant's result is not yet complete. Another step is required, equally necessary and equally important. Immediacy and mediation are formal conditions of every possible relation of subject and object, but the form is inseparable from, and in every case relative to, its content. This principle, the full significance of which Hegel seems to have found through the study of Aristotle, was indirectly confirmed by the very confusions and ambiguities which characterized Kant's attempt to keep them apart in his three critiques. The concrete embodiment of the principle was typically represented first of all in the fact of having a living organism, and more clearly still in the actual process of the moral life of man. The reality of the principle in those two spheres indicated to Hegel, as to Aristotle, how the principle was to be interpreted in other spheres. Kant's doctrine of the primacy of practical reason now received a new and supremely important meaning. The moral life provided the clue to the solution of the relation of matter and form in experience as a whole and in every experience of every kind. For there, the essential union of man's rational activity with nature was the very condition of the experience, and yet the form and the matter of the experience were, as Kant had held, distinct. If, as Kant maintained, the reason at work in moral experience was one and the same with the reason which operated in knowledge, then the reason which was practically, i.e. actually, established as an operative principle of unity of subject and object in morality must be equally the operative principle of the unity of subject and object in knowledge. If, as Hegel interpreted, the position self-conscious reason or spirit actually controlled and permeated the entire range of its material, nature, the moral life, where the separation of subject and object was greatest, and the union of the two the very purpose of their relation, then in this experience we have at once a supreme manifestation of the principle of the unity of form and content, and a key to interpret all other ways in which the unity may appear in experience. Thus then we get the fundamental features of experience with which the phenomenology starts. Experience, wherever it is found, is constituted by 1. Subject and object, 2. An immediate conscious relation, 3. Mediating that relation in a process of reciprocal involution, the one with the other, 4. Within the limits and under the control of an underlying unity or universal, which, 5. Is implicitly or explicitly determined by self-conscious reason or spirit. We next ask, how are the forms of experience to be found? Whose experience is under consideration? What determines the selection of the types to be considered? The answer lies in the nature of the system which the treatise seeks to furnish. The system of experience as a logical and historical aspect. On the one hand, it seeks to be a coherently ordered body of truth. As such, it must work within universals, for the coherence which every scientific system requires can only be obtained by connecting universals. On the other hand, its facts are the manifestation in time of the content and processes of conscious individual experiences. As such, they are historical phenomena, for history is precisely the coexistence and succession in time of the appearances of living individuality. But it is transparent that this system of experience does not appear qua system. For historical experience is a discontinuous disarray of events and occurrences. It is equally clear that every individual does not as a fact take on, either successively or otherwise, each and all of the forms which the human spirit historically assumes. For the purposes of a system of experience, we want therefore to combine these two aspects in a single working conception. The science requires generality, the experience requires individuality. The generality of science must be individualized, the individuality of experience must be generalized. The generality of science is satisfied if it is allowed to abstract a form of experience from a given historical or individual situation, and treat this form as a typical moment of experience. The individuality of experience is satisfied if at any time or any individual situation the typical form can be, as has been, actually realized. Both are satisfied at once if the experience is considered by the system is treated by the experience of a generalized individual. This series of forms of experience, analyzed and connected in the Phenomenology, constitute the experience of such a typified individual. This working conception enables us to treat experience as a whole, and at the same time to embrace the various modes of experience that appear discretely in history. Without it, we should either have mere history, which is inexhaustible and so cannot be a whole, or mere connection of abstract ideas, which cannot be as such an experience. This typified individual is no doubt another expression for the Kantian conception of consciousness in general, and in any case the idea of such an individual is directly analogous to what we find in any science which seeks to deal with living individuality. No physiologist supposes that what he says of the functional operations of an individual organism will be found precisely to hold of any chance individual whom he may examine at a moment's notice. For the chance individual may happen at the time to be below the level of normal health, or may have had his organic functions affected by an endless variety of circumstances, prejudicial or otherwise. Yet the physiologist does not consider that these variations make a science of the functions of the organism impossible. He deals with averages. The average individual is the basis of his science. In a similar way, the generalized individual is the working basis for the construction of the system of experience. Such a conception determines the principle on which the forms of experience are selected, and the manner in which the historical phenomena are treated in the argument. Those selected are, in the main, the constant or recurring forms of experience. We do not find every possible form of experience discussed, but only the forms that serve the main idea of the discussion. Idiosyncrasy and eccentricity are no doubt of interest in human experience, but they have a significance or purpose of biography or autobiography. They are off the main track of common experience and do not play a necessary part in the development of the essential substance of human spirit. Nor do we find all the forms of experience that might have been expected to have a place in the general plan of experience. The restriction in the selection of these forms of experience is largely accounted for by the limitations on which the author worked. Again, historical phenomena are throughout the argument inevitably treated as individual circumstances of a type of experience, not as mere historical fact. This accounts for one of the most perplexing difficulties in the following discussion at certain points. Concrete historical facts are before the mind of the author, inspiring and suggesting the course of his analysis, but hardly a single hint is given of the particular facts in question. It would seem as if history is treated as a mere illustrative footnote to a typical movement or experience, instead of being, as it is, the substance of the movement analysed. The particular time at which the historical facts appear is a matter of indifference to the type of experience, still more to the 1001 details which fitted them into one historical epoch as distinct from another. Hence, at some stages of the argument, currents of history similar to or identical in character but far removed in point of time may operate simultaneously, determining the nature of the discussion, and elements may be drawn now from one and now from another, regardless of historicity. The reason and the justification for such a procedure is that while history may not repeat itself, types of experience do, as we see, for example, from the simple facts of language, custom and tradition. And indeed it may be said that only when a form of experience has been repeatedly inscribed on time's palimpsest so as to produce a composite impression, are we in a position to regard it as a type, and thus an essential factor in the unfolding of complete meaning of human existence. That type and historical fact should thus be indissolubly blended is the argument of the Phenomenology, a necessary characteristic and condition of such a system of experience. Whether the author has successfully interwoven the two in his analysis may well be questioned. It may be said that sometimes he mistakes a side track for the high road, sometimes he takes an incident for a type, sometimes he takes aspects of a type for the whole, sometimes he repeats types at different stages of the development of the whole, but at any rate, there need be no doubt regarding his intention and aim. The last general question of importance concerns the nature of the method of constructing such a system. This is determined by what has already been said. The method, in a word, is that of development. There was nothing novel in such a method. It has been used with success by Aristotle and in modern philosophy by Leibniz. The application of it for the construction of a system of experience has been suggested, even attempted by Schelling in his Transcendental Idealism 1800, where he sought to exhibit all parts of philosophy in a continuous succession of stages, or epochs in the history of self-consciousness. What was new in Hegel's use of the method was due to the clearness of his conception of what he meant by development, and the rigorous, inflexible persistence with which he sought to work it out. In his view, the principle of the method is involved in the very nature of every type of experience, as well as the whole of experience, for the method is neither more nor less than the operation of the form of experience itself, and the form of experience, as we have seen, is inseparable from the content. Indeed, it may be said that the presence of the method is a test of whether or not any apparent case of experience is or is not typical and worthy of consideration. The general character of the method is that of the unification of opposites by a process which reveals their inherent necessity to one another in virtue of their participation in a common principle, and conversely. The specific procedure of the method is that 1. Starting from a prima facie or immediate relation of the terms opposed as subject and object, 2. Showing how they mutually involve and determine or mediate one another, and thereby 3. Evolving in the inner unity of the principle which both establishes and contains their immediate relation and makes possible and necessary their mediation. The procedure is one and the same in its operation in every type of experience and in experience as a whole, for one and the same principle controls and pervades all experience, viz. Self-conscious reason or spirit. And the various types of experience are to the whole of experience as the factors in a given experience, subject and object, are to the type in question. The same method thus spontaneously determines the various chief divisions of the whole argument and the particular stages in the evolution of the meaning of a given type of experience. The author fully explains in his preface and introduction the significance of the various phases of method, and his statements need not be repeated here. Enough has been said to indicate the general nature of the method as applied throughout. But while the system is constructed deliberately by this method, it need not be supposed that the successful use of the method was an unique and mysterious secret of the author of the treatise, who carried out his scheme in the private laboratory of his own mind, without suggestion or assistance from any other source whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the author's claim that his own particular inspiration is quite unnecessary and is even irrelevant, and so far from dispensing with assistance in the construction of the argument, he maintains that his method really operates, though unconsciously, in all minds and in all experience. And there can be no doubt that in the working out of the method the author was guided to a very large extent by results achieved by others, and by facts and suggestions drawn from familiar sources. For one thing, it's clear that before commencing his argument he must have had a definite idea of where his argument was likely to terminate, as of the stage of experience from which it was to begin. And it is not difficult to trace the profound influence of Greek thought in determining the analysis of both the beginning and the conclusion of his system of experience. The discussion of sense certainty in the first stage of the Phenomenology seems little more than a fresh restatement of the analysis and criticism found in Greek philosophy, especially in Plato and Aristotle. The conception of absolute knowledge, with which the Phenomenology concludes, is a reproduction of Aristotle's interpretation of pure thought. Quote, "Pure thought thinks that which is the most divine and most precious, and it does not change. Since it is the most excellent thing, it thinks itself, and its thinking is the thinking on thinking. In productive activity, apart from the matter, the substance or formal essence is the object, and the theoretical activity of the object is the concept or function of thinking. Therefore thought and the object of thought, not being different in the cases where there is no matter, will be the same, and thinking will be one with the object of thought. As human thought holds us in a certain period of time, so the divine thought, the thought which thinks itself, holds throughout all eternity." Unquote. Again, the order in which the various forms of experience are placed between the upper and lower limits of experience was also suggested to a large extent by the mental development of the individual and the historical development of mankind. This was inevitable, for the very nature of experience, as we have seen, involves processes in time, and this occurs in a definite order. If that order coincides with the necessary order required by a logically constructed system, the coincidence may be a chance, but it facilitates and gives vividness to the analysis. Moreover, it is of the essence of the argument to look upon historical processes, whether individual unit or in a larger area of spiritual life found in society, as the condition by which the particular and universal elements of experience become concretely identified and harmonized. Thus, for example, the psychological process of mental development provides the suggestion for the dialectical process of mind, from sense knowledge to perception, or again from consciousness to self-consciousness. The historical evolution of the Greek and Roman society suggests the dialectical transition from the custom constituted to the law-constituted order of society. The historical connection between the individualism of the 18th century and the ethical philosophy of Kant and Fichte suggests the dialectical connection between the atomistic freedom of a revolutionary epoch and the inner freedom of conscience. Such then is the principle and method of this philosophy of experience. When systematically developed, every essential mode of experience must find its due position and validity guaranteed, for the guarantee of the value of every form is the ultimate transparent unity of subject and object in absolute knowledge, and every essential form is required as a stage in the realization of this spiritual idea. The only truth about the whole of experience is thus the comprehensive system of all the forms in which the truth is attained throughout experience. Every essential form makes its own peculiar contribution, and none can be absolutely false, for an absolutely false relation of a subject and object is either meaningless or a contradiction in terms. We may describe the system as a critique of experience, but only in the sense that such a criticism is the self-criticism of experience, for beyond experience we cannot possibly find anything, still less a standard to criticize experience. We cannot arbitrarily break up experience into separate parts and elaborate independently a critique of knowledge, a critique of morality, and a critique of beauty, for all of these are but forms of one experience. Experience is the common denominator of them all, and must be construed as a whole. In short, a true critique of experience can only be a connected system of the whole of experience. It is manifest that such a system is no more than an orderly arrangement of the ways in which experience appears. It does not expound all the truth that the various modes of experience themselves contain. Each mode forms a nucleus of a sphere of truth all its own, and the elaboration of which is a separate undertaking by itself. The substance of the truth which each contains is only relevant to the argument, and is only introduced so far as it is necessary to bring out the peculiar nature of the kind of experience each mode embodies. Again, the phenomenology is distinct from empirical psychology on the one hand, and the concrete life of the individual experience on the other. The growth of mental life of the distinction between subject and object is presupposed before experience can be said to exist, and the growth of that distinction in time is part of the work of the psychology to trace. On the other hand, relatively to the living agent in concrete experience, the phenomenological observer is like the historian or the dramatist who perceives and understands the play of forces controlling the living agent, and traces the connection of the moving principles that operate unseen and certainly unforeseen in the production of their result. It is equally clear from what has been said that the phenomenology is not a complete system of philosophy. It is at the most part, and, the author has insisted, the introductory part to a comprehensive philosophical system. The exhaustive elaboration of absolute knowledge would alone be a complete system of philosophy. All that is done in the phenomenology towards such a system is to show that absolute knowledge is a mode of spiritual life and has its roots in experience, and is the consummation and final cause of the whole process of experience. The author endeavoured in his other works to construct the entire system of absolute knowledge, but the success or incompleteness of this achievement does not affect the value of the argument in phenomenology, which justifies the standpoint of absolute knowledge. But, though the phenomenology is not a complete system of philosophical knowledge, it is itself a philosophical systemization of the modes of experience, for only a philosophical argument could justify the validity of the philosophical point of view, and this Hegel does by showing that every mode of experience in the long run derives its validity as an avenue to the truth from the fact that it implies the essential principle of philosophical knowledge. The argument of the phenomenology is undertaken to prove that the interests of all forms of knowledge are bound up with the validity of philosophical knowledge. The phenomenology enables us to determine the position of absolute truth, and the parallax of the absolute can only be found if we take as our baseline the diameter of the orbit of human experience. It is not necessary here, even if it were in place, to defend the argument of the phenomenology from possible lines of attack and criticism. Least of all need it be asserted that we have in this work the last word of philosophy regarding the nature and meaning of experience. The discussions of philosophy are not to be reduced to the level of a brawl in a marketplace, and no serious philosopher ever made a merit of having had the last word. But so much may be said. If in principle, aim and result, the argument of this work is untenable, idealism, whether as a creed or as a system, may once and for all be abandoned. Indeed, any attempt to put a spiritual interpretation on the facts of human life. In a sense, the present work contains little that is new beyond the method by which the forms of experience are wrought into a connected system. In a manner, it is but an elaborate exposition of the doctrine expressed in the well-known lines. How exquisitely the individual mind, and the progressive powers perhaps no less, of the whole species to the external world is fitted, and how exquisitely too. The external world is fitted to the mind. Wordsworth preface to the Excursion. That experience must in the long run obtain its explanation and justification from itself may be regarded as a truism, and again that the absolute embodies itself in all modes of experience, as it requires every form of truth to constitute the whole truth, and only in the entire extent of our human experience can we read the full meaning of the absolute spirit in which we live and move and have our being. These are propositions acceptable in every age and recurring as regularly as the days of the human calendar. We might even say, in the words of the unsophisticated child of nature, Ungefähr sagt, dass der Pfarrer auch nur mit ein bisschen anderen Worten, from Faust. But the familiarity of much of the substance under discussion will not lessen the value of the argument in the eyes of those to whom a comprehensive conspectus of experience is an intellectual need. That they will find both light and leading in this remarkable book there can be no doubt. To these the book may be safely commended, and those whose need is greatest will find the most. The best edition of the text is that of Georg Lassen, pastor of St. Bartholomeus Church in Berlin. This appeared in 1907 and is a most carefully collated recension of the work. The translator was fortunate in being able to make use of this edition in the final revision of the translation, which was begun long before Lanson's edition appeared. Another competent student of Hegel, Professor Bolland of Leyden, has also produced an edition of his work in 1907, but this is merely a reproduction of the second edition of 1843, beautifully printed on beautiful paper. All the footnotes accompanying the text of the translation have been appended by the translator. For some of these he is indebted to editions of Lanson and Bolland. The editions of 1807 and 1843, Hegel's Werk II, contain no notes. In addition to the footnotes, the translator has also written short introductory paragraphs for most of the sections and subsections to which the work is divided. These paragraphs will be found in small type within brackets. They are intended partly to be explicatory and partly to be a guide to the argument, partly to indicate the background of historical fact to which the analysis refers. In default to a full-length commentary, which it is hoped may someday appear, these paragraphs may be found useful to the student of the book. In translating the work, there has been no attempt to do more than give a rendering of the original, which would be faithful to the meaning and as close to the style of the text as was consistent with clearness and intelligibility. There seems no doubt that the work was written with less regard than usual to literary effect, and with more regard to the logical coherence of the result than is common in works in philosophy. The appalling struggle of the author to carry out his self-imposed task of arranging the crass material of experience into an organically connected plan of necessary thought, and of satisfying his demands for philosophical system, overwhelm all other considerations whatsoever. It is impossible, as it is unfair, to expect anyone who is staggering under the weight of absolute truth to move to the graceful measures of literary minuet. He is content to let his meaning be expressed in the way that comes readiest to his hand and offer the least impediment to the movement of his thought. The consequence is that the style throughout of the work is severely formal and is only relieved at times by the crudest and homeliest metaphors. It is no part of a translator's task to improve his author, and when the thought of the original is clad in wincey, then it is not the translator's business to drape it in satin. The translator has therefore refrained in the present case from attempting to make the reproduction more attractive from the literary point of view than the original. He can only hope it will not be found to be less so. In the task of revising and correcting the proofs, the translator has been placed under deep obligations to those who have kindly assisted him with suggestions and criticisms. The whole of the proof has been read by the general editor for the series, Professor Muirhead, and by Mr. McLeaver, lecturer in philosophy, Aberdeen University. George Lassen, pastor in Berlin, has also given invaluable help with the translation. The early part of the translation has been greatly improved by the suggestions of Professor Pringle Pattison of Edinburgh. Whatever merit the translation of the middle portion of the work may possess is in large measure due to the careful criticism of Mr. Jocham of Merton College, Oxford. The Right Honourable Mr. Haldane MP has read proof of considerable part of the work, and the translator is also indebted to Miss Haldane for criticisms in one of the most difficult sections of the argument. King's College, Aberdeen, March 1910. End of the translator's preface. Recording by Morris in Arlesey, Bedfordshire.